Hey everybody, it's Jay Steven here of Real Crusades History, and I decided I wanted to do a podcast that was basically a fairly thorough rundown of the Battle of Montgisard, one of the great engagements between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Ayyubids, which took place in 1177. I'm going to read several sources, and I want to start off with one of my favorite descriptions of the Battle of Montgisard from an excellent book called Crusading Warfare, 1097 to 1193, by the great military historian R.C. Smale. Smale's book, it's fairly old, so some scholarship has come out that has added to the knowledge that's in it. But his descriptions of a lot of the battles in the history of the Crusader states in the Levant are quite interesting and also very useful. So we're going to go ahead and look at R.C. Smale's description of the Battle of Montgisard. Here it is. In 1177, Saladin suffered the heaviest defeat of his career at Montgisard. Once again, the medieval records give no tactical information, but only how the battle came to be fought and why Baldwin IV was the victor. Saladin entered Palestine from Egypt by way of the coastal route. Baldwin had sent a contingent of his knights to Antioch with Philip of Flanders, but despite his reduced resources, he immediately challenged the invader. Impressed by the numerical superiority of Saladin's forces, he decided against battle and took shelter with his forces in Ascalon. Saladin then decided to ignore the Franks. He marched north to lay waste the countryside and cut communication between Jerusalem and the coast. Baldwin's subsequent action revealed his own conception of his military duty. He had shown at Ascalon that he was not prepared to undertake battle against heavy odds. Now he showed that he would rather fight than tolerate the unchecked devastation of his subjects' property. Therefore, he hastened after Saladin and attempted to surprise him, while his men were scattered in their search for plunder. He was not completely successful, but when the battle, of which there exists no detailed account, was fought, Saladin had not been able to recall all his detachments. Baldwin achieved partial surprise and drove the shattered Muslim army back into Egypt. So that's Smale's description, sort of overview of what went on. And a couple of things that I think are noteworthy. First of all, Baldwin IV, this is the famous Leper King, Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem. He was very young when this took place. He was about 16 years old. He'd only been king for 3 years. And Saladin didn't really have much experience with him. And one of the things about this particular invasion is that a lot of the Crusader forces were up north, involved in a campaign that coincided with the arrival of Count Philip of Flanders on crusade. So King Baldwin IV, the young leper king, was quite reduced in terms of the strength that he was able to field against Saladin. And you'll notice that Saladin, when he didn't really consider Baldwin's small force that he brought to bear that much of a threat. Initially, Baldwin didn't really think he could challenge Saladin in the field, but when he realized that Jerusalem was possibly threatened, and the devastation that Saladin was visiting upon the kingdom, because basically Saladin he felt free to plunder the countryside unchecked. Baldwin decided to do something about it, and he actually was pretty bold in his decision to attack Saladin's forces, because Saladin's army was so much larger than his. But he had several very good tacticians with him. Reynald of Chatillon was with him, as well as the Knights Templar. The Grand Master of the Templars at the time was with him, Odo of Saint Amand, who was also a very impressive tactician. And my guess is that they understood that Saladin had made a mistake in letting his guard down to an extent. His troops were not that well formed as they were moving across the territory of the kingdom, and there was an opportunity for attack. And this is the kind of situation, I think, where the Frankish charge, the famous cavalry charge of the Crusaders, could be so effective, and we're going to kind of see how that turns out. All right, the next source I want to read is William of Tyre's description of the Battle of Montgisard. And William of Tyre is very useful when it comes to anything in the reign of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem because he was so close to the action. William of Tyre, he was a contemporary of this period, and he in fact was one of King Baldwin IV's mentors and teachers. And so he was very close to the king and just to these serious events that we're looking at. And his description of Montgisard is very good and very useful, and also just exhilarating. I mean, it's a powerful description of this battle. Probably the best we have in terms of the source material. So I'm going to go ahead and read William's description of the Battle of Montgisard. While these events were happening in that part of the country, news was brought to the king that a host of the enemy, scattered far and wide over the land, had seized upon his domain. Thereupon he immediately left Ascalon with his men and prepared to march against the foe, for he felt that it was wiser to try the dubious chances of battle with the enemy than to suffer his people to be exposed to rapine, fire, and massacre. So, marching along by the seashore, he was following the coast that he might come upon the enemy stealthily, and suddenly, when he reached the place where Saladin was encamped on the plain, he immediately directed all his forces, both cavalry and infantry, in all their martial array against him. He was joined by the brethren of the Knights Templar, who had remained at Gaza, and together, with ranks in battle formation, they prepared to meet the foe. As they advanced, intent on the one purpose of avenging their wrongs, the sight of the fires on every side, and the reports of the massacre of their people, inspired them with divine courage, and they hastened on as one man. Suddenly, opposite to them, and not far away, they saw the enemy's lines. It was about the 8th hour of the day. During this interval, Saladin had learned that the Christians were advancing in the hope of fighting. Dreading the engagement, which heretofore he had apparently desired, he sent out messengers to recall his troops, who had scattered in various directions, by the sound of the trumpet and the roll of the drums, and by admonitions also. As is usual at such times, he sought to encourage his men for the conflict, and to rouse them by his words. With the king were Odo of Saint-Amand, the master of the Knights Templar, and 80 of his brethren, Prince Renaud, Baldwin of Ramla, and his brother Balian, Renaud of Sidon, and Count Jocelyn, the king's uncle and seneschal. Their numbers, including all ranks and conditions, were barely 375, led by the wondrous life-giving cross which was borne by Albert, Bishop of Bethlehem. And after first invoking aid from on high, they all advanced in battle formation, eager for the encounter. In the meantime, the enemy's forces, who had ventured some distance away to seek booty and spread conflagration, began to arrive from different directions, a circumstance which greatly increased Saladin's strength. In fact, had not the Lord, who never fails those who put their trust in him, graciously inspired our men with inward courage, the Christians would have been driven to despair, not only of victory, but of liberty and safety as well. However, they nonetheless drew up their forces in battle array, and arranged their lines according to military rules, disposing in proper order those who were to make the first attack, and the reserves who were to come to their aid. The ranks of fighters on both sides now gradually approached each other, and a battle ensued which was at first indecisive, but the forces were very unequal. The Christians, however, strengthened by the grace shed upon them from on high, soon began to press on with ever-increasing boldness. Saladin's lines were broken, and, after a terrible slaughter, were forced to flee. Wishing to ascertain the actual facts, I made a careful investigation of the enemy's numbers, and from the narratives of many trustworthy people found that 26,000 light-armed cavalry, in addition to others mounted on camels and beasts of burden, had entered our territory. And here's a note from the translator. It is probable that William accompanied the king on this campaign. The use of the first person here, the definiteness of detail, and the fullness of his description seem to indicate that fact. Of these, 8,000 belonged to those splendid soldiers called in their own language Toasin. The other 18,000 were the common knights known as Carnegoles. 1,000 of the most valiant knights acted as a bodyguard to Saladin. All these wore yellow silk over their breastplates, the color that Saladin himself bore. It is the custom of Turkish satraps and of the great chiefs, who in the Arabic tongue are called emirs, to rear with great care certain young men, some of whom are slaves captured in war. Others are bought or perhaps born of slave mothers. These youths are instructed in military science, and when they have reached manhood, are given wages or even large possessions according to the merit of each. These men are called in their own language Mamluks. To them it is entrusted the duty of protecting the person of their lord in the vicissitudes of battle, and upon them in no slight degree depends the hope of obtaining the victory. Always surrounding their lord, they endeavor with one accord to protect him from harm, and they cling to him, even unto death. As one man, they continue to fight until he has fled. Consequently, it often happens that while the rest make good their escape by flight, nearly all the Mamluks fall. The Christians pursued the defeated foe from the place called Montgisard, until day declined and night fell upon them. For 12 miles and more during this entire flight, the foe was mercilessly slaughtered, nor would any of their number have survived had not the swift descent of night rescued them from their pursuers. To assist them in their flight, the stronger men and those who had swift horses threw away their arms and apparel, abandoned their packs, and leaving the weaker people behind, fled with all their might. Thanks to the approach of night, these escaped death. The remainder met with a worse fate, for all were either captured or put to the sword. At the very beginning of the engagement, we lost 4 or 5 knights and some foot soldiers, but the exact number of these is not known. When those who had escaped by flight reached the marsh just mentioned, they cast into the sedges and into the water itself whatever they still carried, namely their breastplates and iron-shod boots, that they themselves might proceed unimpeded. Even weapons were thrown away into the water, that the Christians might not use them, even as tokens of victory. All these things, however, were soon recovered by our people, for following hard on the footsteps of the flying foe, that very night and the next day, they carefully searched the reedy swamp just mentioned, and, by combing the swamp itself with poles and hooks, speedily found whatever the foe had hidden there. We had heard from persons worthy of credence that in one day they saw 100 breastplates recovered from that place, besides helmets, iron greaves, and other articles of less worth, which still were valuable and useful. This notable mercy, worthy of remembrance, forever was conferred upon us by divine grace in the 3rd year of King Baldwin IV, on November 25th, the feast of the holy martyrs, Peter of Alexandria and the Virgin Catherine. The king went back to Ascalon, where he awaited the return of his forces, who had pursued the fugitives by different roads. Within 4 days they had all arrived, loaded with plunder, carrying tents and driving before them slaves, troops of camels and horses. They came, according to the words of the prophet, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Okay, so a really powerful description of the battle from William here. So a couple of things. He discusses, first of all, the ambush or the surprise that the Crusader army used to in their strategy against Saladin, and he discusses some of the people who were with King Baldwin. First of all, a fairly large number of Knights Templar, about 80 of them, he says. Reynald of Chatillon is there with a force. He also talks about some of the Ibelin brothers being there. Balian of Ibelin is there with his brother Baldwin and some other important lords, but it's a fairly small force. He himself gives a number for Saladin's force, which is 26,000. Now, what exactly were the numbers from this battle? We can't know for sure, of course. Whatever the number was, we know for a fact that the Christians were considerably outnumbered in this case. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that at first Saladin didn't take them seriously. And of course, on top of that, there were a lot of Christian forces that had gone north to involve themselves in this campaign with Philip of Flanders. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem was considerably reduced of its available forces. It's interesting here that William describes Saladin's bodyguard, and he describes the institution of the Mamluks itself, how these are slave soldiers. Some of them are captured slave boys who are raised to be these elite warriors. Some of them are purchased, and he describes how some of them they attain high status in Ayyubid society, in Muslim society, and they can become very important individuals who even have large land holdings that they own. But these are the people who would have been guarding Saladin himself, and quite fiercely and with a lot of determination. But we do see here how the Christians shatter Saladin's lines, and the part where it really becomes devastating is this long pursuit. We've got several days of pursuit where the Christian knights are able to pretty much just hunt down these fleeing Muslim troops. And notice how they throw everything away. They try to lighten their load, and this is the classic sign of an army that's in just a totally panicked retreat, a rout. You'll call it just a disorganized flight. Basically, is what we're looking at here. Every man for himself, just trying to get away, throwing away all their valuable equipment, leaving behind people who can't keep up. And just a lot of these troops are just killed. This just massive casualties that Saladin suffers in this battle. Okay, now we're going to take a look at a Muslim source. This is one that's quite close to Saladin, Baha ad-Din, whose actual name was Ibn Shaddad. Ibn Shaddad was one of Saladin's closest advisors and indeed one of his friends. He wrote a biography of Saladin, which you can purchase today in translation as The Rare and Excellent History of Saladin. And on page 54 of that translation, you will find Ibn Shaddad's account of the Battle of Ascalon. The Battle of Montgisard. It's quite a bit shorter than William of Tyre's. Not surprisingly, a lot of times you don't want to dwell on a serious defeat. So this is Ibn Shaddad. The commander of the Franks was Prince Reynald, who had recently been ransomed at Aleppo, for he had been a prisoner there from the time of Nur ad-Din. This day the Muslims suffered a setback, and the Sultan told me how the defeat happened. The Muslims had drawn up for battle, and when the enemy approached, some of our men decided that the right wing should cross to the left, and the left cross towards the center, in order that when battle was joined, they might have at their backs a hill known as Ramla land. While they were occupied in this maneuver, the Franks charged them, and God decreed their defeat. They suffered a terrible reverse, and they had no nearby fortress they could take refuge in. They set out for Egypt, got lost on the way, and were scattered. Many of them were taken prisoner, including the jurist Isa. It was a major defeat which God mended with the famous Battle of Hattin. To God be the praise. So a couple of things interesting about this account. First of all, it's kind of an abbreviated version of William of Tyre's account. He does sort of talk about how the Muslims weren't really in very good order. He talks about how it was the Frankish charge that really was most devastating to the Muslim forces that day. And then he talks about the sort of frantic retreat, and how he talks about people getting lost as they try to get back to Egypt. They're scattered. Many of them are taken prisoner. So I'd like to end my presentation here by reading Malcolm Barber's account of the Battle of Montgisard from Barber's excellent book, The Crusader States. Now I want to read this one because this book came out very recently, and so it's kind of an updated account from modern day historians, especially in regards to R.C. Smale's account, which, is quite a bit earlier in the 20th century. So yeah, this book came out very recently, The Crusader States by Malcolm Barber. It's excellent. And his account here of the Battle of Montgisard is quite good. So, when, however, in the autumn of 1177, Saladin realized that the major part of Frankish forces had gone north to Harim, he seized the opportunity to invade the southern part of the kingdom. Neither Ibn al-Athir nor Ibn Shaddad explains his reasons, but those are two Muslim chroniclers. But to William of Tyre, it was obvious that he hoped either to damage the kingdom or to force the abandonment of the siege of Harim. It may have been because of this perceived weakness that, in Ibn al-Athir's words, the Muslims became overeager and relaxed, moving about the country secure and confident. Saladin, therefore, left his heavy baggage at Al-Arish, and accompanied by his more lightly armed troops, made a sudden appearance in front of Ascalon. Baldwin had assembled all the forces he could find, but was obliged to retreat into Ascalon on the night of 24 November, leaving the Muslim forces to raid the entire area as far as Jerusalem. William of Tyre paints a bleak picture of an abandoned Ramla and of the citizens of Jerusalem huddled in the Tower of David for protection. So Jerusalem was very much threatened during this campaign. William's account heightens the dramatic effect of the Christian victory that followed the next day. Baldwin's army was heavily outnumbered, even though William's figure of 375 knights, opposed to 26,000 light cavalry, 1,000 of whom were Saladin's personal Mamluks, cannot be taken seriously. The Christian army included Odo of St. Amand, the master of the temple, with 80 brethren, some of whom had come from the garrison at Gaza, and the leading barons, Baldwin of Ramla and his brother Balian, Reynald of Sidon, and Jocelyn of Courtenay, the royal seneschal. It was commanded by Reynald of Chatillon, who had been procurator of the kingdom and the army, following the refusal of Philip of Flanders to take responsibility for the kingdom in the autumn of 1177. They took with them the true cross under the care of Albert, Bishop of Bethlehem. The armies met on 25 November, below a hill known as Montgisard, between Ramla and Ibelin. William of Tyre says that initially the engagement was indecisive, but that soon the Christians broke Saladin's lines, chasing his army into a nearby marsh. Saladin later explained to Ibn Shaddad what had happened. His army had been charged by the Franks while it was carrying out a maneuver that involved the right flank moving to the left and the left into the center. According to Ibn al-Athir, the Franks caught them as they were trying to cross a river, and one of them almost reached Saladin before himself being killed. Saladin later turned this incident to his own advantage, claiming that he had been spared by God for a purpose that he had in mind. Ibn Shaddad calls this a terrible reverse, for many men and animals and much equipment were lost in the aftermath. The following 11 days were exceptionally wet and cold, and few of the fugitives succeeded in returning to Cairo. Some suffered so much that they gave themselves up, rather than spend any more time in the open. However, it had been a very bloody battle for both sides. 1,100 Christians had been killed, and 750 were treated for wounds in the hospital in Jerusalem. Indeed, with so many wounded, the Hospitallers would have been hard-pressed to cope, first treating survivors in their field hospital, which was a large tent they took with them whenever a major confrontation was expected, and then carrying them back to Jerusalem as soon as possible, using relays of camels, horses, mules, and donkeys. William of Tyre attributes the victory to divine help, but cannot resist adding that had the Count of Flanders and Tripoli been present, they would have claimed it for themselves. Okay, since Malcolm Barber talked about it so much, let's go ahead and read Ibn al-Athir's account of the Battle of Montgisard. Can't resist. So Ibn al-Athir, of course, he's coming from a more Zengid perspective, so he's often viewed as being a bit biased against Saladin. Of course, when he's looking at a battle between Saladin and the Crusaders, he takes Saladin's side. But Saladin being an Ayyubid, Ibn al-Athir took a more Zengid perspective. So, different dynastic perspectives within the Sunni Muslim world. So, this year, Saladin marched from Egypt to the Syrian littoral, aiming to raid Frankish territory. He assembled large numbers of his standing troops and abundant levies. They continued their march, pressing on with all speed until they reached Ascalon. on November 18th, 1177, which they sacked, making captives, slaughtering, and burning. They scattered throughout those regions in raiding parties. When they saw that the Franks did not field an army nor gather any force to protect the lands from the Muslims, they became overeager and relaxed, moving around the country secure and confident. Saladin came to Ramla, intending to attack one of their fortresses and put it under siege. He reached a river, and the troops jostled together to cross. The next thing they knew, the Franks were upon them with their battalions and their champions. Saladin only had a part of his army, because most of them had dispersed in search of booty. When he saw the Franks, he stood firm, with the men he had. Saladin's nephew, Taqi al-Din, Umar ibn Muhammad, advanced and personally engaged in the fighting before his uncle. Several of his men were killed, and the Franks also had losses. Taqi al-Din had a son named Ahmad, a very handsome youth. Just at the time, he had first grown a full beard. His father ordered him to charge them. He charged, fought, and returned safely, having had a mighty effect on them. Ordered to go back a second time, he charged and met a martyr's death, and passed away with much praise. Allah have mercy on him, and be pleased with him. One who fought the fiercest that day was the lawyer Isa. Allah have mercy on him. The rout of the Muslims was complete. One of the Franks charged Saladin and got close, almost reaching him, but the Frank was killed in front of him. The Franks crowded about him, so he departed in flight, traveling a little and then stopping to allow the troops to catch up with him until night fell. He proceeded through the desert until he came with a small body of men to Egypt. On the way, they suffered great hardship. Food and water was in short supply. Many of the army's horses perished through hunger and thirst, and because of their precipitate flight. As for the troops who had penetrated Frankish territory as raiders, most of them were lost, either killed or taken prisoner. One of those captured was the lawyer Isa, who united learning, piety, and courage. His brother Zahir al-Din was also taken prisoner. The two of them had joined the rout and lost the way. They were taken along with several of their men. They remained for years in captivity, and then Saladin ransomed the lawyer Isa for 60,000 dinars and a sizable number of prisoners. Saladin arrived at Cairo in the middle of 8 September 1177. I have seen a letter which Saladin wrote in his own hand to his brother Shams al-Din at Damascus, and which tells of this incident. It begins with this verse. I remembered you when the Kati spear was quivering between us, and the brown straightened lances had drunk from us. He says in the letter, we were on the point of death more than once. Allah preserved us, praise be to him. Just for a purpose that he had in mind. It only holds firm because it has a purpose in view. Okay, guys, there you go. A very thorough account, I think, of the Battle of Montgisard. Absolutely fascinating and powerful event in the history of the Crusades. A stunning victory for Baldwin IV and the Templars and the Crusaders, and a devastating defeat for Saladin and his army. Hope you guys enjoyed that. It's quite interesting. So, thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, pick up a copy of my novel, Why Does the Heathen Rage? A Tale of Crusader Jerusalem in the 1120s. It features one of Baldwin IV's ancestors, King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, as a main character. Also, I'd like to say thanks to my latest Patreon supporters, Yakov, Powell, and Robert, all of who pledged $5 monthly. Thanks so much, guys. And if you want to support Real Crusades history, you can do so on Patreon. Patrons get exclusive content that's not available here on the main YouTube channel. And they also get to interact with me personally on Patreon. You can also donate to Real Crusades history via PayPal. The links to both of those are in the information box below. I'll talk to everybody soon. Thanks so much for listening.